Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the morning of Thursday, the 18th of October, 2018. And the sun is literally just breaking over the ridge behind me. It's absolutely blinding, so I can just about make out the silhouette of the cameras here. But it's a very fresh morning here in East Lancashire, the first serious frost of the year. It's about 3 degrees right now, but no doubt the sun is going to lift the temperature to something really unseasonably warm later today. Well, what an interesting week it's been. And yesterday we had the amazing but absolutely correct decision by the appeal courts to release the three protesters who had been sentenced to 15 and 16 months jail in respect of their lorry surf in July of 2017. And the appeal court making it very clear that they believed that the custodial sentences were somewhat excessive and inappropriate, and in fact stating that it would have been more appropriate to have awarded them some or sentenced them to some community service. But on the basis that they have served 3 weeks, which is the equivalent of a 6-week sentence, then they were released immediately. Now, I understand that there is going to be a mass gathering at the gates of Preston New Road on Saturday, and the three who have been released will be present. So obviously Quadrilla have stated that they've started the frack. Well, I think the reality is that they've started to pressurize the well, and this is the initial mini frack, and the purpose of this is to establish the pressure at which the geology will start to give way. Now, this can take a little bit of a while because they're going to want to do this relatively gently. They'll build up the pressure gradually until such time as the geology starts to fracture. And then, of course, they'll back off, and then they'll plan the full frack, the full detail of it with the volume and pressure that they'll use for the initial frack. But they haven't really started yet, and they're not out of the woods because, of course, this is the stage where Rathlin Energy actually lost control of the well at West Newton some 4 years ago, and ended up having to abandon the well. And in fact, although they do have permission to drill a second well on that same site, they have yet to return to that site. So, you know, one can hope that the incompetence of Quadrilla will show through, and that there'll be a similar result here. It's rumoured that they had to evacuate the site a few days ago, but at the moment there's no disclosure as to the reasoning for that. Let me just try and get the cameras out of the direct sunlight here a bit. It's Pendle Hill behind me. It's absolutely stunning here in East Lancashire. Anyway, on the same day as the three were released, then the right-wing popular media, I'll use the term loosely because their popularity is waning at a phenomenal rate, trot out Stephen Pollard. Now, I know this is going to appear back to front on the camera because I'm using the front camera, but this is the editorial by Stephen Pollard, who is trotted out every now and again by the Sun when they want to try and demonize a segment of the community. So the headline here is: "Fracking will solve our energy crisis and bring jobs. We can't let mob rule stop it." Well, Stephen Pollard seems to have an extremely short memory because, of course, the mob on this occasion is the government and the corporatist mob. Because had the democratic process been allowed to take the role that it should take, i.e. precedence over corporatist and parliamentary mob rule, then, of course, Quadrilla would not be at Preston New Road right now, because the decision as taken by Lancashire County Council's Planning Committee in July 2015 would have been sacrosanct. But of course, Saeed Javid, as Communities Minister in Parliament to represent the interests of the global banksters, effectively overturned the county council decision by going through the charade of a planning inquiry and then instructing the planning inspector to not announce his decision, but to let him make the final decision. And of course, he's also stated, he's on record as saying that he is minded to grant the application for Quadrilla to drill at Rossiter Wood, just a few miles to the north. But that was an application that was also rejected by Lancashire County Council. So we can expect more bunk like this from the media, claiming that this is necessary for Britain's energy needs, when we know fine well it isn't. And in fact, the UK is in danger of actually descending into a sort of third world country that is effectively raped and pillaged by the corporatists, with absolute disregard for the health and well-being of the wider population. Well, it's not necessarily all going their way, of course. There was a Twitter poll which was organised by Martin Lewis, and some 19,681 people participated in this poll. And basically the question was, should we allow fracking? And the response of yes, we should allow fracking was 22%. Yes, but not near me was another 6%. Don't know, don't care, 9%. But a resounding 63% voted no. And of course, one can pretty much guarantee that the yes, allow fracking brigade was from areas of the country that are not under any threat. The reality is, if you held that poll and restricted the participation to those who live above the Bowland Shale here in the north of England, then the likely result is something of 85 to 90% voting against. But of course, the corporatists don't live in this area. The corporatists, if they work in this area, tend to have a main residence elsewhere in the country and just rock up here, when it suits them. So, the wider population still very much against this industry, despite the efforts of the mob, the corporatists and their puppet politicians, to try and drive this through. Now, there's some other aspects of this whole industry that people really need to start taking account of and an interest in. Now, I think 2 years ago, in a discussion with Dr. Graham Downing on an episode of Humanity versus Insanity, we actually discussed the risk of releasing new bacteria into the environment as a result of deep drilling, and particularly hydraulic fracturing, releasing gas and fluids, along with everything else that has been contained in this tight geology for millennia. Well, yesterday there was a report produced by Terry Hazen, who's the head of the Institute for a Secure and Sustainable Environment and Joint University of Tennessee National Laboratory Chair for Environmental Technology. Now, obviously, you can bet your bottom dollar that this isn't a chair that's funded by the oil and gas industry. But his report makes the observation that frac fluids can strengthen bacteria. Now, this isn't necessarily bacteria that's brought up from the deep, that's another concern, but this is existing bacteria who then, as a result of frac fluids and frac waste migrating into groundwater, then the existing bacteria becomes antibiotic resistant. And he makes this observation: in areas where frac waste has leached into groundwater and streams, there has been a measurable increase in resistance to antibiotics. And this resistance, he observes, can be passed on to other organisms, including pathogens. So if someone drinks water which has antibiotic-resistant microbes in it, there is a very strong probability that those people will, over time, develop a resistance to antibiotics themselves. Now, then we have the other issue, which is what's referred to as extremophile bacteria. Now, this is bacteria which is effectively unknown until such time as it finds its way to the surface as a result of these deep well operations. And he makes the observation that research teams are also finding extremophile bacteria, which has been pulled out from deep underground by the fracking operations. These bacteria are used to extreme heat and pressure, typical of being deep underground in tight geology. Terry Hazen said, "We don't even call them bacteria, we call them archaea," noting that they are from ancient times. Well, you know, the US is on track, apparently, to surpass the production of hydrocarbons of Saudi Arabia. So within sort of 2 years or so, there is a very strong probability that the US becomes the #1 producer of hydrocarbons on the planet. And the reality is that the mob just don't care about those who have the misfortune to live in the sacrifice zones. And we see that, you know, with the likes of Francis Egan, you know, trotting out his palliatives, saying that, you know, he feels really good about being on the cusp of the first frack since Quadrilla screwed up in 2011. Of course, he wasn't in the chair of the company at that time, but, you know, he feels good about it. Well, you know, this is indicative of the man. You know, you bring in a sociopath from another country who has absolutely no emotional connection with the country that is being targeted. And unfortunately, the sad individuals who are on the payroll of these companies, then they have the phenomenal ability to enter into a state of cognitive dissonance, to absolutely ignore and dismiss any of the concerns presented by others. And as for the science, then, you know, they just dismiss it as pseudoscience if it doesn't support their agenda. Well, you know, this issue of the bacteria and the frack fluids making bacteria ever resistant to antibiotics and new bacteria coming into the surface arena, you know, just take a look at the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which is what, a little over 8.5 years ago, almost exactly, actually, on Saturday. It's 8.5 years. And you know, the living bacteria that appeared to emanate from that well. In fact, I remember there was a Channel 4 documentary, which was it was an interview, and it was cut at the moment that the person being interviewed said that it looked like the sea was alive. And, you know, this was possibly the genetically modified bacteria, which BP admitted to introducing into the Gulf to try and deal with the slick, or, as was surmised by many researchers, this was something that had been released as a result of the Macondo well blowing out. And it might also explain why there were submarines from many other nations in the Gulf at that time trying to get samples of whatever it was that was emanating from the Macondo well. So, you know, this isn't known territory, and anyone who wishes to dismiss this as just rampant conspiracy would do well to do some of their own research and take a look at the information from academic, from scientific and experiential sources that makes it very clear that these concerns are very real and are being deliberately dismissed by the mob, the corporatists and the parliamentarians. So, where are we at right now? Well, of course, the industry is on the cusp, it thinks, of its first frack since 2011. But the unpopularity of this industry and the concerns associated with this industry are rising exponentially. And of course, the only way in which this industry can even begin to think about getting a free ride is to seek High Court injunctions. Now, it just so happens that I'm a named defendant on the injunction that is in place at Prestonby Road and the injunction that is in place for the iGas sites at Tinker Lane, Mission Springs and Ellesmere Port. But you know what? There comes a point where people have to do whatever they feel they need to do to prevent the country from descending into a mob rule. And these injunctions are not only an affront to democracy, they are an affront to human decency, because it's very, very clear that those who seek the injunctions live in a world of cognitive dissonance, and the judges who rule to grant these injunctions are deliberately ignoring the scientific, academic and experiential evidence that is basically staring them in the face to give the corporations free rein to pollute the resources of this country. So whilst obviously I absolutely encourage people to fully comprehend the implications of breaching the injunctions, then my stance is that if those people choose to take the step and say, you know what, the injunctions are wrong, they are just out and out wrong, and we are not going to just roll over and simply allow this industry to establish a footprint. Now, obviously, the appeal court has ruled that custodial sentences for peaceful protest are excessive. Now, what's going to be interesting is at the moment, of course, these companies are choosing to ignore breaches of the injunction. And the reason being is because what happens is they want to go back to court at the appropriate date and say, see, the injunctions worked because nobody breached them. Well, actually, what's happening is people are breaching the injunctions, but the companies are choosing to ignore those breaches on the basis that they don't want to admit that the injunctions just aren't worth the paper that they're written on. And that is my stance right now. We'll go through the charade. And in the London courts, I mean, yesterday was a tremendous result. And of course, in Newcastle last week, with the attempt by Gateshead Council to put an injunction on Mark Steele, we have seen the judiciary over the last week actually perform as it should perform and apply balance. Unfortunately, the commercial courts do not have a track record for doing this. The commercial courts work on the basis that commerce is king. And basically, commerce has absolute priority over the health and well-being of the wider population, and particularly if that population happens to live a long way from London. So, we are at a very, very interesting cusp. If the people of this country do roll over, then we do indeed live in mob rule by the corporatists and their puppet parliamentarians. Well, I think that over the next few weeks, we're going to see that that is not an acceptable situation, and that an increasing number of people will be doing whatever they feel it's appropriate to do to attempt to hang on to the last vestiges of democracy in the United Kingdom. Well, of course, I have an event. I shall be hosting an event in London on Sunday, the 2nd of December, with some of the most outstanding analysts and commentators sharing their thoughts as the Western world descends into mob rule, the rule by global corporatists, and perhaps stimulating curiosity so that more people will start to do their own research and understand that what's rolling out here isn't random. It is by design. There is a script, and in this country there's a charity and I'll use that term very loosely, that has been operating for exactly 30 years. And that is to train people to be put into senior public service positions in this country to bring about the destruction of those public services. And that organisation is Common Purpose. And of course, it shouldn't be any surprise to people who are following what's occurring that Sheena Ramsey, the chief executive of Gateshead Metropolitan Borough Council, who perjured herself in the court in Newcastle last Thursday, is indeed a graduate of Common Purpose. In fact, she was one of the early graduates from 1992. And if we look at her track record at Knowsley Council and Worcester City Council, we see that she has upheld the ethos of Common Purpose and has left a trail of destruction in her wake. So please do your own research, people, and I will be back tomorrow. And if you can, of course, get along to Preston Road on Saturday, and then maybe you stay there beyond Saturday. But if you can get along to Preston Road on Saturday, let's send a massive message to Quadrilla, to Lancashire County Council, to the British government, and to the global corporatists that the people will not take their mob rule lying down. You have a great day, and I'll catch you tomorrow at 8:30.